It's Ramadan. Are Muslims more open to gospel conversation right now or less open than ever?
Sometimes we'll look at Islam from a Christian vantage point and we'll see, well, this just seems very inconsistent, that somehow you can please God and do enough good works to be admitted into paradise. And we see some of the illogic if you have a God who would draw near in his holiness and righteousness. But actually, Islam is a consistent faith. It's just that if you don't have a God who would dwell in his holiness and righteousness among his people, then the sinful condition of those people is no longer the imminent danger to them when this holy and righteous God draws near. So a God who's remote can overlook somebody's sin, ignoring it, and neither that God nor the sinner need to eradicate it. Whereas for the Christian thought, sin is a horrifying reality, not only because it's an offense against an eternal God, but because God in his blazing righteousness is a God who would draw near. And if we are permeated by sin and impurity, how are we to bear his presence?
Matt Bennett offers answers today. Plus, should Christians serving in Islamic cultures fast during Ramadan? We'll explore, but first, a special message. If you're a regular listener to this show, we wanted to say thank you. Without the Lord's help and without you, we wouldn't still be doing this. But we also want you to know that this show wouldn't exist if it weren't for ABWE International and ABWE missionaries like Justin, who's a missionary in a Muslim country in Asia. So let me tell you about him. One day, he was wandering a crowded street doing street evangelism. He'd been doing it every morning for 9 months with no results. He was discouraged. He sat down at an outdoor coffee shop. Local men crowded the table, fraternizing before the start of the workday. Justin tried to start a spiritual conversation with the Muslim man seated next to him, and the man, disinterested, walked off. But before Justin could even process the rejection, he heard a voice speaking to him in broken English. The voice said, "You said sins forgiven. How?" It was another Muslim man who had been sitting next to him who was listening silently the whole time. Justin, knowing the dangers of doing evangelism openly in this country, started to whisper to him about Jesus. They crept closer and closer until they were inches apart. They were looking around for danger the whole time. Justin whispered the gospel into this man's ear, and the man grabbed him by the shoulders, pushed him back, and said, "Many of us want to know this message, but we're not allowed to ask." That's what life is like in a country where evangelism is illegal, and more than 130 ABWE workers like Justin are serving in places like this. Every gift to ABWE's Global Gospel Fund goes to critical staffing, support, training, and services to advance the gospel to the lost and unreached through faithful workers like Justin. So learn more and become a partner with ABWE at abwe.org/partner. That's abwe.org/partner. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Communications with ABWE, joined by Scott Dunford, pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California, and he does a little bit of ABWE stuff on the side in the realm of missions. Excited for the guest that we have on the show today, a friend of the show. I don't even remember how many times that Matt Bennett has been on the show here before, and so we'll let him introduce himself in just a second here, Scott. But as we're recording right now, it is currently, for over 1 billion people in the world, Ramadan. For those of you who are, like us, burdened for Muslims, it'd be an interesting time to think about how God's working in the Islamic world. Scott, I'm really curious, when you were ministering to Muslims overseas, at least a Muslim sub-pocket and subculture inside of a bigger culture that wasn't Islamic, what was that like when Ramadan came around? How did that affect your ministry? Because it's like, okay, this month, are they going to be more open to the gospel or especially unopen to the gospel?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm excited to get Matt talking about this too. But it was interesting. Some people were very much focused on it and really trying to get it right this month, and really gonna fast well. And then others were pretending that they were going to do this when they were around certain Muslims and then not doing it at other times. I do tend to think, at least in my experience, it was a time of more spiritual reflection and a time of serious seeking. And so, I've had some good conversations during Ramadan, including a good conversation even last night with some friends of mine. And it is interesting in a community like this where you see a lot. I mean, where I live, there's a lot of Muslims, and I've got it's called El Halal Taco Truck. It's the only halal taco truck in the area, and it's right across. It parks right across the street from the church, and I'm getting to know the owner. And
sounds amazing,
man. When sun goes down, that place is packed, and everyone's. And even last night when I was meeting with some friends of mine, once the sun goes down, there is there's a lot of gathering, a lot of good food getting eaten. I don't want to steal the thunder though, but I'm excited to have this discussion, and something that it's very close to my heart, but also very close to our experiences. So if you're okay with it, Alex, let's just invite Matt into the conversation. Matt, it's really good to have you. Professor at Cedarville University, teaching missiology and theology and writing a lot for a lot of things, including ABWE's blog. We're so thankful for you. Also, we're just privileged to call you a great friend. Give us a little update on how things are going for you and your ministry, a little bit about your background for those who maybe don't remember from the multitude of times you've already been on our show, and then launch right into what is Ramadan anyway.
Yeah, it's always great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me back again and letting me play along. I always feel a little bit cooler after getting to hang out with you guys. So thanks for that.
It's the beard butter.
It's the beard butter. That's the key. I spent about 7 years living in the Middle East with my family, ministering among Muslim people, learning the culture, studying Islamic theology as a part of my dissertation as I was working through doctoral studies. And through this, the Lord has really just cultivated in me an undying passion to see Muslims encounter the Jesus of the Bible, and to see the beauty of the gospel that the Quran promises but simply can't deliver on. And so Ramadan is an important time in the life of our Muslim friends and neighbors, and it is, in my experience, a time where they are far more open to having conversations. And so I want to see Christians, whether they be abroad or whether they be in the United States and places more familiar, keyed up and ready to be those who would be there to have those conversations over an iftar meal at the end of the day.
So give us the nitty gritty, give us the nerdy professor lowdown. Like, what is Ramadan? How did it come about? In Muslim theology, what happens at Ramadan? The origins of it, all of those kind of things, and even just how it lays out in practice practically.
Wow, you guys really do like me. You let me get to nerd out. This is fantastic.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
This is what we need.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you open up any kind of intro to Islam book, it's going to talk about Ramadan as one of the key pillars to the Islamic faith, where 30 days out of the year they are to set aside for fasting. And this fasting happens from sun up to sundown. And then at sundown each day, there's a big celebration called the iftar where they break the fast. This is what you will find in an introduction book, but it's also something that you'll see in the streets and in the mosques and neighborhoods where your Muslim friends are living. But it is interesting, and since you've invited me to share a little bit of some of the nerdy parts, it is interesting to ask where Ramadan came from, because actually, according to Islamic tradition, it was born about the same time that Muhammad was being rejected by the Jewish community in Medina. So part of Muhammad's story is that he was initially given this call as a prophet in Mecca. He was persecuted there, and then he fled with his disciples, his small band of believers, to a place called Medina. And there he encountered several pockets of Jewish communities. And he assumed that being a prophet in the same line as Moses and Abraham and Jesus, that he would be well received by this community. But actually, they rejected him pretty quickly upon his arrival. Well, one of the ways that he had encouraged his followers to seek the approval of the Jewish community was to observe their fasts and observe some of their celebrations and to offer their prayers in the direction of Jerusalem. So that's how Muhammad entered Medina in an effort to kind of court the approval of the Jewish community. But when they rejected him, he received revelation that in fact his followers no longer needed to observe this 10-day fast, which he saw the Jewish community observing, and instead their fast was to be one that extended over 30 days. Likewise, at this time, their direction of prayer was redirected from praying towards Jerusalem and towards Mecca. And so you see at this point something of a distinctiveness entering into even the early Islamic community's self-understanding, according to the Islamic traditions, of course. But what's interesting about that 10-day fast is that 10-day fast that the Jewish community would have been observing was their, if I can say, workaround for not having the temple to make their Day of Atonement sacrifices. Right. And so you've got a sidestepping of the concept of substitutionary blood-bought atonement that is present in the Jewish community, trying to receive God's blessing without being able to go through God's means. And rather than understanding the underpinning theology of the Old Testament as it gave some of the teaching on the idea of atonement, you see this observation of a fast that now is just made triple the length within the Islamic history as a way of one-upping the Jewish community. You could perhaps read that into it. And then also a way of establishing Islam as something that is distinct and new by virtue of being 3 times as pious.
So Ramadan, every year, it's a month. You can't eat or drink or have sexual relations or anything like that during the day. At night, then there's feasts, and it would be an iftar, would be what that meal is called. And it's a time of celebration. Some traditions would teach that Satan is bound in a certain way during that month, and some traditions would maybe say your good deeds count for more right during that month, and of course that's critical to an Islamic understanding. So that's what's happening from a religious or spiritual standpoint. What happens in an Islamic community during Ramadan? So aside from El Halal taco stands being hopping places after dusk.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, during that iftar time, usually this is a time where families will intentionally gather together. They'll have some specific foods that they will use to break the fast. Usually it's something to do with dates. And they'll break the fast together, celebrating the fact that they have completed another day of fasting and demonstrating their piety through that. They'll do some extra reading of the Quran, and then typically in the evenings there will be extra prayers. And this is particularly true during the last 10 days of Ramadan, because sometime during the last 10 days is thought to be the day where Muhammad received the revelation of the entirety of the Quran. So, but they don't know exactly what day that is. And so during those last 10 days, there's additional prayers, additional time spent in community during the midnight hours as they are coming together, seeking to pray, and then hopefully find themselves in prayer during that night of power, which is thought to be worth 1,000 times a normal. They call them hasanat, the merits that you get for your good works. You get 1,000 times that benefit on the night of power. But since they don't know, they end up spending more often than not evenings in prayer in the mosque for those last 10 days in community, really seeking to say, well, since we don't know which day it is, we'll just cover all 10 and hope to be found in prayer during that time.
So I've read and I've heard from Muslim friends of mine that like during that night, whenever that night of power is, that there's a sense in which heaven is closest to earth and God is more present, which is really interesting and very, very much different than the Christian understanding of God's immanence. Can you maybe just tease that out, help us explain that a little bit more? What is different about the theology of Muslims to Christianity in that regard, or even maybe explain a little bit more of the thinking behind that?
Yeah. So there's probably some communities that would say that it is God who draws near to the lowest heaven in order to dispense forgiveness. Most would see that not necessarily as God, but maybe a messenger of God who is drawing nearer to be closer to offering a more total forgiveness or purification for people as they're repenting and seeking that during this time. But I would say if there's one central difference between Islamic teaching and Christian teaching, it is exactly that question of what do we understand as God's presence? Is it possible for the one God who has created all things to actually commune and commingle with his creation, or would that actually disturb our concept of his transcendent nature? For our Muslim friends, it's more often that they would appeal to this idea of tawheed, or the oneness of God, that makes him absolutely and forever separate from creation in such a way that he would never have a meaningful and present relationship with his people. Usually the closest that Muslims will talk about in terms of intimacy of relationship between creation and God is that of the maker and the made, the judge and those who are judged. And there's never any sort of intimacy of Father. And the idea that God would be God with us, as in a God who dwells in the tabernacle, or even worse, one who dwells in flesh, or who sends his spirit to inhabit us as the temple of God, or who one day in the eternity will make all things new and tabernacle with us again. That beautiful hope that characterizes Christian thought around the presence of God is absent from within Islamic hope and theology, because God is transcendent and remote in Islam.
Yeah. So much of even the Quran just kind of reads like a polemic against the idea of Emmanuel, the idea of the incarnate God. It reads like it was written to attack that specifically. Sometimes, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. And sometimes we'll look at Islam from a Christian vantage point and we'll see, well, this just seems very inconsistent, that somehow you can please God and do enough good works to be admitted into paradise. And we see some of the illogic if you have a God who would draw near in his holiness and righteousness. But actually, Islam is a consistent faith in terms of its orthodox teaching. It's just that if you don't have a God who would dwell in his holiness and righteousness among his people, then the sinful condition of those people is no longer the imminent danger to them when this holy and righteous God draws near. So a God who's remote can overlook somebody's sin, can cover over it by ignoring it, and neither that God nor the sinner need to actually eradicate it. Whereas for the Christian thought, sin is a horrifying reality, not only because it's an offense against an eternal God, but because God in his blazing righteousness is a God who would draw near. And if we are permeated by sin and impurity, how are we to bear his presence? And you can think of Nadab and Abihu as exhibit A for what happens when a holy God is approached by those who are sullied.
So is there a level of spiritual warfare that happens around Ramadan, that time each year? For you, when you were living in the Middle East, did that feel like a different time? And how did that affect your ministry?
Yeah. I mean, I would say there is an awareness of spiritual warfare kind of at all times when you're talking with people who are pursuing the God who created them in ways that are contrary to his created order. So there's a sense in which you see the impact of distortion on what is true and what is right and good in the exhibition of any non-Christian faith. And so it's kind of one of those things that permeates any interactions with peoples of other faiths, is that awareness that there's an enemy at work who is distorting what the one true God has revealed of himself in creation and in his special revelation of himself through the gospel. So I want to be careful to say that I think there's always some level of spiritual warfare at work. But then when you do get to a concentrated month where everybody is devoting themselves to this ultimately futile pursuit of pleasing this God without having their hands washed by his atoning blood, without having their sins forgiven by his substitutionary sacrifice, then you become significantly more aware of the weight that they are bearing and the fervor with which they're trying to pursue these fruitless and ultimately unsatisfying means of pleasing this God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, because when we ask about spiritual warfare, we tend to define that really narrowly in terms of, there's demonic activity, or there's something crazy happening with witchcraft or something like that. But anytime we're bringing arguments down, right? 2 Corinthians 10, we're bringing those arguments under the feet of Jesus, that is spiritual warfare. And that's happening every time the gospel's involved in mission. And so we want to talk about how Christians are supposed to act during Ramadan and how we can love our Muslim neighbors and bring Christ to them this month. We'll do that in just a moment with Matt Bennett of Cedarville University. Hey listeners, want to meet us? Well, we'd love to meet you. And if you're hungering for a deep, no-fluff missions conference, keep listening. The Radius Missiology Conference is happening June 23rd and 24th at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis. The theme this year, Acts, the gospel proclaimed through the church. Hear from John Piper, Mark Dever, Brooks Buser, Chad Vegas, and more. Now, Scott and myself will be there in person, live, recording, interviewing speakers, and enjoying the fellowship. If you're like us, it's probably been a while since you've been to a conference, so get out of the house and come. And enter our drawing to attend for free. That's right, free. Simply go to missionspodcast.com/RMC for details. And we'll see you there this June at the Radius Missiology Conference.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I'd like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hamar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or his people. Our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention was formed to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention.
And this June, attend the national conference. Go to abuseprevention.org and register with ABWE21 as the promo code to receive 20% off your ticket. That's promo code ABWE21 to receive 20% off. We're back with our good friend of the show, Mr. Matt Bennett. Or I guess Dr. Matt Bennett. I don't even know.
Mr. Doctor.
Mr. Dr. Matt Bennett of Cedarville University and of missiology fame. And we're so glad to have Matt here talking today about how to be missional during Ramadan. So
let me interrupt for a second. Can I interrupt for a second? Because Matt's a good friend, so he'll allow us to do this. I just want to say, Alex, every single time I hear our ad that says, do you want to meet us? I keep thinking of someone out there going no way. Why would I want to meet these two guys? And then I kind of wonder too, do we really want to meet them? I don't know. I don't know. I just want to throw that in there, Alex. Maybe you want to edit this out later, but it is a real existential problem for me as we listen to these ads.
Hey, as a faithful listener, I am one who's convinced that, yes, we do want to meet you guys. So be encouraged. Now, the second question is still up for debate, whether or not you want to meet us out there.
Okay. Sorry, I just had to say that. It bothers me every time. It doesn't bother me. I like it. It provokes a lot of thinking. Deep thinking. So, but anyway, sorry, Alex.
Scott, I just want to meet you. I mean, it's been so long since we've been together in person. I just want to meet you. I'm beginning to forget what that's like.
It's been a week. So yeah, I mean,
yeah, it's been a real long time. Well, let me drag this kicking and screaming back to the topic and back into the realm of the practical. I've got a Muslim friend who lives actually closer to your neck of the wood than mine, Matt. He's in Ohio. And it's something I'm wrestling through is do I text him and say Ramadan Mubarak or not? Right? But do I pray, Lord, reveal yourself to him as he's seeking you, or is he not seeking you? Is he seeking a false God? And maybe, Lord, reveal yourself to him next month when he's when he's less in the throes of this false religion, right? I'm not even entirely sure how to think through those things. So help us walk that out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the question, I would say, the check in your spirit. Am I participating in something or communicating something that I wouldn't be comfortable communicating, to reach out and say Eid Mubarak to you, or, Eid Saeed? If you feel like, well, he's going to receive this language of blessing in terms of hasanat that he might be getting, and that's going to be undermining some of my Christian witness, then by all means, you might say Happy Ramadan to you, or Ramadan Saeed or something, so that it's a slight deviation on some of those words that might be loaded with additional baggage. But in terms of just general posture towards our Muslim friends who are celebrating this month, I would say by all means engage as much as you can. They are in a place where they are conscious of their need to please God, or at least to walk according to God's ways. They are committing themselves to something that really is a radical reorientation of their schedule, in that they're flipping an entire month to commemorate the fact that they are in pursuit of God and his truth. And so if you're encountering somebody who's inclined to follow God, by all means, that's somebody that you want to engage with. Even if they're moving in the wrong direction, that momentum can be helpfully reoriented into a conversation around the truth. And so when we were in the Middle East, oftentimes we would find ourselves with some of our friends saying, we'd love to celebrate the iftar with you today. And, as Christians, we're called to fast. And one of the things that we do in fasting is to show God that we know how much we are dependent upon him, and spend additional time in prayer, committing ourselves to that. So today I'm going to fast during the same time you are, but I'm going to be praying through Jesus that he would work in my life. And then I'd love to participate in your community gathering at the end and be there just to be with you. And so at those times,
let me ask a follow-up question about that. So sounds like from your personal practice that you personally chose to fast in tandem with some of your Muslim friends. Was that confusing? Because I think the critique of that would be that they're fasting as part of a works righteousness system. You're operating out of grace. Are you hyper contextualizing there and confusing them, making them think that you're doing something similar, which is, I'm trying to appease Jesus, just like you're trying to appease Allah? How did you deal with that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And usually what I would do is I would take some time to say what I am doing, to clarify, hey, we both didn't eat today when the sun was out, but we had a different why for that. And so it gives an opportunity to then actually be able to say, I'm fasting, and I'm fasting in prayer, knowing that God is present with me, that God is hearing my prayers and receiving them. And the only reason that I can tell you that I know that is because Christ died. He has cleansed me so that the offering of worship that I bring before him, I know is acceptable because he's called me son. And so it opens that opportunity then to say, I'm not just kind of throwing good works out into the sky and hoping that they land in my favor at the end in the judgment, but rather it's an overflow of something that I know has already been accomplished. And so we found that fasting alongside of our Muslim friends actually allowed us greater opportunity to explain the difference of Christian fasting, particularly in the context where we were, where there were some Orthodox Christian communities who actually they had specific fasts that were assigned to more than half of the days of the year. And so it functioned in our Muslim friends' eyes as something that was very much the same as their understanding. It's just a good works, a way of making sure that you're marking your calendar by the knowledge of God. Whereas this allowed us to distinguish not only from Islamic fasting, but also from an Orthodox Christian fasting.
Another question that I would have then there's a difference between prayer in the Islamic sense and prayer in Christianity as well. Salat is not always, it's in Arabic. You don't even always know what you're praying necessarily. I can see how that would easily become a formal external ritual. Whereas, especially for us as Protestant evangelicals, I mean, like we look at our brothers in the Lord on the other side of the pond with the Book of Common Prayer, and we're like, oh, that's legalism. I mean, we highly value. I'm not saying I do. I'm saying that, right, that sometimes we have this tendency to look
Confessions with Alex.
Yeah, not at all. We have a tendency to look at any kind of form to prayer with suspicion. We, in our particular Christian tradition, highly value extemporaneous prayer, arguably too much. I guess I'm tipping my hand there. We maybe value extemporaneous prayer a little bit too much, but then we would still say that it has to be according to knowledge, right? Like there has to be a conscious recognition there that the words and the language of those words means nothing. It has to be in spirit and in truth. And so did you have to bridge that gap there too? Because you're saying, yeah, I'm praying too, for them to realize that, that doesn't mean that I'm going to church and I'm reciting something in Koine Greek 5 times a day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find all of those opportunities to clarify what I mean when I'm saying that, because the word salli comes from the verb salli was the word that we would use to pray. Well, it's the same root as salat, but in a Christian terminology, that does mean something very different theologically, even though the same form of the word is used. And so that's one of the, on the surface, it's a complicating feature of ministering among Muslims in the Arabic language, because the Arabic language is laden with Islamic baggage just because of the nature of where the Arabic language derived from the writing of the Quran. But then it actually can provide a much more meaningful opportunity to say, hey, when I say this word, I'm guessing what you're hearing is something that accords to the 5 times a day when you do your rote prayers to remember the ways of God. Well, actually, when I say salat, this is what I mean. I mean that in Christ, I'm before the very throne of grace, and I'm received as one who can with confidence cry out, Abba, Father. And like, this is a wildly different understanding of what I'm doing. And so my fasting likewise comes out of that heart of having been provided for in every way, including the knowledge of my salvation in Christ. And so it's an overflow of my gratitude that causes me to say, even these good gifts I want to put aside in order to show God that I am aware of my dependence upon him and to seek his face. So it actually, though there can be confusion if you were just to demonstrate that I'm fasting and not explain it, then I'd say, yeah, that's a problem. But if you come in and say, hey, I'm fasting for a different reason. When I say prayer, I'm praying with a whole different concept of what that is and where I am in regards to the presence of God.
So it's not that we're trying to say, hey, these 2 things are the same, but these are things that are similar that have very different ends.
Yes. Yeah.
In contrast. Yeah.
Similar in a sense. Yeah. But scratching beneath the surface, participating in something like that, and then having an evening to talk about it actually gives you the chance to show there's similarity in the actions that we did. But again, the why and our understanding of what we were doing is actually wildly different. And so for you to understand me, you need to realize that I didn't just do what you did. Like, I actually fundamentally think of this in a different fashion.
Yeah. Now, did you receive the, I don't know if this was a critique that others, or maybe a concern that others would have expressed, but I could imagine making a case that you're taking gospel wine and you're putting it in Islamic wineskins, sort of, right? Like I do think there's like a de-emphasis in the New Testament on things like fasting compared to the Old Testament, right? You have the command to afflict oneself on the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament. There's not a comparison to that in the New Testament. There's not a specific day set apart for fasting under the New Covenant. And you could argue that some of those things are because, hey, we're looking back on redemption now, not looking forward to it. We know our atonement by name, right? And we're no longer hoping and aspiring for that. We're living out of that. And so I guess the question would be like, what is there a tension there though in a picture of Christian piety that looks very abased and I don't want to say legalistic because we believe in prayer and we believe in fasting, but does it by putting it into those wineskins, into that context, does that dampen the grace message that you're bringing when you talk about that? So that's the honest question. I'm just curious, and cards on the table. I think a missionary living in an Islamic context has Christian liberty to choose whether or not they want to pray in a Christian way, particularly that month, in order to open up those conversational doors. That's probably like a Romans 14 kind of Christian liberty issue there. And then when you're done answering that, I also want to ask, okay, but what about a Christian living in the States here too? I'm not in an Islamic context. I've got one Muslim neighbor, right? So how do I minister to him too? I'm not surrounded. But first, that answer of, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, no, that's good. And I'm very sensitive to the inclination to insider movement confusion that comes along with those things. So,
yes, you've written on that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You know that I'm resistant to anything that would smack of that. I think for us, it was something that was distinguished enough from Islamic fasting by simply being something that was, hey, I'm not doing this all month, but on Thursday when we go out for iftar, I'm going to fast along with you, and I'll tell you a little bit about what motivates me to fast and what I mean when I'm doing it. So yes, we're both foregoing ingesting food and water during this season, this period of time, and we're going to get together and we're going to celebrate, breaking that fast together. But there's also sufficient interpersonal opportunity to be able to clarify, like I said, what I was doing. And I think the gospel roots that come out of that and just what the gospel has affected in changing what I mean by fasting and what I mean by praying, that it actually provides great opportunity to say, yeah, we both did the same activity, but mine is wildly different in terms of the theological underpinnings. So the other, I would say the distinction would be, some might say, well, then you can also pray in the mosque in the Islamic style 5 times a day, because what's the difference, right? Well, at that point, you're gathering in a community of people. You are coming in line, moving your body and saying the same words as the community around you without opportunity to explain beyond simply being observed as one who's fitting in. In our situation, there weren't people trailing around us who were observing us fasting. It was something of a conversation with an existing relationship where we said, hey, let's break the fast together. I'm going to fast, and let me tell you why. And so then you have the opportunity to say, I'm not necessarily just fitting in here, but this is something I'm called to do. Can I tell you why I'm called to do it? In the context of a relationship that's not assumed to be self-interpreting, just simply by being observed. Does that make sense?
It's helpful clarification. What would be some tips that you would give to somebody who, again, is living in the U.S. and yeah, I'm not surrounded by Muslims everywhere, and there's not a mosque near me, but I do have that one Muslim neighbor, that one Muslim coworker. I'm not necessarily gonna, modify my entire lifestyle for a month to set up those evangelistic conversations, but there might be unique inroads there right now during the month of Ramadan for them. And what does that look like in your opinion?
Yeah, a couple years ago, I had a buddy who I met in town who was helping me out with my cell phone. Introduced himself as Mo, short for Muhammad, and found out he was from Palestine. So we kind of hit it off in real casual sense. Well, when it came to Ramadan, I shot him a text and said, happy Ramadan to you. And he responded and was like, hey, actually, I just had a baby, and we're sponsoring the iftar tonight. So I'd love for you to join us as my guest as we break the fast tonight. Thanks for reaching out. And so as a result of wishing him a happy Eid, he invited me to meet the entire Muslim community. We went and had the iftar in the mosque area, and we had a chance to talk about our experience living in the Middle East. We had a chance to share the gospel. They asked specific questions like, how did you find Muslims, and what do you think about the things we believe? And so it was this open table for us to be able to say, well, I think there are some significant differences. I love the people, and I found them very welcoming, and some of my best friends are Egyptian, but at the same time, I do see that there are some fundamental differences, and here they are. So I would say even just those little things like you were saying with your friend, to be able to reach out and say, I'm acknowledging that there's a season of the year that you're observing that's important to your religious identity, and I want to reach out and be sensitive to that. More often than not, you're going to have them responding with gratitude, and then you're tipping your hand to saying, I'm a religious person who's concerned with religious things and aware of what's going on, which can then lead to really good conversations beyond that.
I also want to say, we do have lots of listeners who live in places where they really don't know Muslims yet. Or aren't aware of them. There's some great prayer resources. We want to continue to emphasize the role in the ministry of prayer. You can go to 30 days of, it's called 30daysprayer.com, 30 days of prayer for the Muslim world. It's a prayer guide. You can think through some of those things, or even just as you're hearing us tell stories of the Rohingya in Bangladesh, or the Egyptians, the Egyptian Arabs, in Egypt, or even the Uyghur people, and the things that they're going through, that God would just be working in among those circumstances. Just spending that time, uniquely praying for God's salvation, God's healing, God's mercy and grace in the lives of our Muslim friends and neighbors, I think could be a great ministry as well. So Matt, as we're closing, thank you again for joining us on the show. We have, a lot of work to do in prayer for sure in this time. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Cedarville and how people can get a hold of you, or even, if they want to have students they want to send to Cedarville, how to best to connect with to do that?
Yeah, clearly I'm biased, but I think Cedarville is one of the most uniquely situated universities to be able to prepare missionaries for wherever the Lord would send them. We have a degree program here for just about any vocation that you might want to pursue, and along with any degree that you get from Cedarville, you also get a Bible minor, meaning that you get 5 classes in basic hermeneutics, in Old Testament, New Testament theology, and it lays a good foundation, which really, actually, especially at Cedarville, can serve to launch you into a Master's of Divinity program. We've made a way for a condensed Master's of Divinity to be attached onto just about any one of our 4-year degrees.
That's
so
cool.
You could go and get a business degree, and then in 2 more years, you could get a Master's of Divinity with a focus on missiology, and you could take your business acumen and go do the work of missions with a theological foundation sufficient to actually be engaged in doing disciple making and even having an eye to church planting. So I think we're in a really unique situation here, and I'd love to talk to you more about that if you are interested.
And then come do your internship with me.
Or me.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, very cool. We're really grateful for you, Matt, and grateful for the work of Cedarville and the ministry that's happening there. And we will leave that contact information in the show notes. But for all of you listening, be in prayer for your Muslim friends and neighbors this month. And before we go, if this show has been at all a blessing to you, please remember to share and subscribe. And when you do that, also leave us a positive rating and a 5-star review in your podcast app of choice. That pleases the tech overlords who allow us to stay on the air. And so we're grateful for that and what that does for the algorithm, at least what we're told it does for the algorithm. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com. Until next week, thank you for listening.